funny how a single, ordinary day can become a dividing line in your life, a point you look back on and realize nothing was ever the same again. For me, that day started like any other. The morning sun was just starting to burn off the mist over my fields, and the only sound was the distant crow of a rooster. Then the silence was shattered. It wasn't the sound of our farm equipment or the animals. No. This was the sound of progress. The kind you hear from the suburbs. It was the loud, unmistakable rumble of a bulldozer. But it wasn't on the land next door. It was on mine. It was on my family's private farmland. And they were tearing up the ground. A brazen scar slicing right through our property line. I remember my heart rate spiking. My mind raced from shock to cold fury in a split second. How could this be happening? Who gave them permission? I knew instantly what this was about, and I knew who was behind it. It was the homeowners association from the new subdivision that had sprung up just beyond our western fence line, and their so-called president, a man named Bob. From the moment they broke ground on their first house, they had made it clear they considered my private property a minor inconvenience at best. They saw our quiet, open land not as our home, but as an opportunity, a blank canvas for their perfect, little planned community. This right here was the moment everything escalated. They were building a new access road, a shortcut to their main entrance, and in their minds, they could simply pave it right over my property without even asking. They believed they were entitled to it. What they didn't know was that they had just made the biggest, most expensive mistake of their entire lives. This wasn't a small disagreement or a simple boundary dispute. This was the first shot fired in a war they couldn't possibly win. You see, I am not a confrontational person. I'm a man who prefers peace. But I am also a man who has no tolerance for bullies and an unshakable belief in what's right. My initial attempts to be reasonable were met with petty dismissals and arrogant smiles. Their harassment would only grow worse, and their threats more brazen. But for every single obstacle they put in my way, I would find a way to quietly and methodically turn it into a legal weapon. This all led to a final, incredibly satisfying moment of justice. An ironic twist where a judge would force them to pay me a king's ransom and, in the ultimate act of poetic karma, order them to rip up the very road they had trespassed to build. And I'm going to tell you exactly how I made that happen. To understand how I won that fight, you first need to understand what it was that I was fighting for. My story isn't just about a piece of land, it's about a way of life. For 5 generations, my family has lived on this farm, a sprawling patch of quiet tranquility, tucked away from the constant hustle of city life. When you grow up here, you learn the rhythm of the land, the scent of rain-soaked earth, the low thrum of the irrigation pump in summer, and the crisp, clean air that fills your lungs on a cold morning. This farm isn't just property on a deed. It's the history of my family, the place my grandparents built their lives, and the place I always assumed I'd raise my own kids. It was a peaceful existence, and I truly believed that our quiet, rural bubble was immune to the petty drama that seemed to define the outside world. I was incredibly, profoundly wrong. The outside world came to us in the form of a new housing development that sprouted up on the neighboring field. At first, it was just a few earth-moving machines and skeletal frames of houses. We paid them no mind. Everyone has a right to build a home. But then, the houses started to fill with people, and with those people came the predictable suburban bureaucracy, a brand new homeowners association, or HOA, complete with a carefully manicured welcome sign and an even more carefully chosen president. Her name was Karen. And from the moment I first saw her, I knew she was going to be trouble. Karen was one of those women who looked like she was permanently on her way to a very important meeting. She wore a red suit with a starched collar and carried a clipboard everywhere she went. She was the kind of woman who didn't just walk, she strode. Her voice had the kind of polished, confident timbre that made you assume she was always right, even when she was objectively, glaringly wrong. To her, my home wasn't a family farm. It was an untidy, inconvenient relic that stood in the way of her perfectly planned community. My old tractor was an eyesore. Our cattle were an unauthorized nuisance. In her mind, her HOA wasn't just a governing body for her subdivision. It was a crusade to civilize the unkempt rural landscape that surrounded it. The very first run-in I had with her, she introduced herself by handing me a copy of their HOA bylaws. She said, with a perfectly polite but condescending smile, "Just so you're aware of the new community standards, neighbor." My land wasn't in her HOA, and I told her so. She simply nodded and said, "Yes, but our community's presence here changes the dynamic. It's for the benefit of everyone." It was the kind of tone that made me feel like I should be thanking her for the privilege of her condescension. She was a textbook example of a woman who was drunk on a tiny bit of power, convinced that a title and a set of rules made her the sole arbiter of good taste and moral behavior. And her biggest problem, as she saw it, was me. I remember thinking after that first interaction that things were going to be tense, but I had no idea how far she was willing to take it. She and her board saw themselves as pioneers, bringing order and aesthetic perfection to what they considered a desolate frontier. They were so consumed by their own sense of righteousness that they simply stopped seeing the world through any lens other than their own. They didn't see my family's property. They saw a future park, or maybe a bike trail. They didn't see my private land. They saw a perfect spot for a shortcut that would add to their property values. Before we get into the details of exactly what they did, I want to take a moment to ask you a question. If you've ever had to deal with an overzealous HOA or a power-hungry neighbor, drop a comment below and tell me your story. I know I'm not the only one. It's a special kind of frustration when a single person's inflated ego becomes a threat to your peace and quiet. My initial thought was to simply ignore them, to continue living my life and trust that the obvious legal boundaries would be enough to keep their manufactured drama at bay. I tried to be reasonable, even friendly. I waved to them in their cars and gave a polite nod when I saw Karen in town. I was trying to maintain a peaceful, neighborly truce, but a truce requires two parties to respect the other's boundaries. And it quickly became clear that their definition of a boundary was a lot more fluid than mine. It was only a matter of time before that fragile truce would be shattered. That fragile truce was shattered with the arrival of the surveyors. One day, I saw a couple of people in high-vis vests walking along the fence line, stopping every few feet to consult a map. I drove over in my truck thinking maybe they were new, and I'd just point them toward the correct property markers. But when I approached them, their answers were evasive. They just said they were confirming the right-of-way for a new access point to the subdivision. When I pointed to my fence and told them they were on private land, they just nodded, packed up their gear, and disappeared back into the subdivision. It was a perfectly polite, completely non-confrontational interaction. Yet it left a knot in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I knew they hadn't just made a mistake. They were testing the waters. My suspicion was confirmed a week later when a certified letter arrived from the HOA. It was printed on thick, expensive-looking paper, and the tone was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese. The letter claimed that a recent review of community access needs had identified my land as a potential site for a shared recreational pathway and alternative vehicle entry. It was full of phrases like common good, community development, and mutual benefit. There was no mention of asking permission. Instead, it informed me that a survey team would be making adjustments on my property in the coming weeks. They weren't asking. They were telling me what was going to happen. I immediately tried to call Karen. My first call went straight to voicemail. The next day, I called the number for the HOA board listed on the letterhead. A chipper voice answered. A woman I'd never spoken to before. I explained the letter and my concerns. She listened politely, then, with a rehearsed calm, said, "Oh, you'll have to speak to the president about that. She handles all neighborly disputes." She gave me Karen's cell number, which I already had, and ended the call with a curt, "Have a wonderful day." I was being given the runaround, intentionally. I finally got Karen on the phone 2 days later. She sounded inconvenienced, like I was interrupting her very important schedule. When I explained that I didn't appreciate the letter and wanted them to stay off my property, she sighed audibly. "Look, neighbor," she said, and the word neighbor felt like a patronizing jab. "I understand this might be a little unsettling, but we have our own legal counsel. Our surveyors are very good at what they do, I assure you. We're not doing anything that isn't completely legal." Her voice had that smug, unshakable confidence that comes from a position of authority. I asked her what right-of-way they were referring to since my deed was clear. There was a pause. "Oh, that's just a technicality," she said dismissively. "We're just gathering data." "Relax. You'll thank us for the improved property value." Later, I hung up the phone feeling completely stonewalled. The woman wasn't interested in a conversation. She was interested in getting her way. Over the next few weeks, the harassment became more subtle, more insidious. I'd be out working on my tractor, and I'd see one of the HOA members pull their car over on the side of the road pointing at my fields. I'd be in town, and I'd catch Karen giving me a nod with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a constant reminder that they were watching, waiting. The air, which used to feel so free and open, now felt heavy with suspicion. I began carrying my phone in my pocket at all times, ready to record just in case. I took photos of my fence line every few days. My peaceful existence was being eroded, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety. I thought their next move would be another vague letter, but I was wrong. The HOA's next move was to directly and brazenly trespass on my land. One afternoon, I walked a few hundred yards out into my field to check on our fence, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Bright orange flags had been hammered into the ground, about 30 feet past my property line. Each one had a small plastic tag on it with cryptic initials and numbers. It was clear what they were for: drainage. A new road would need a new drainage ditch. They weren't just surveying anymore, they were staking a claim. My patience, which had been stretched thin, finally snapped. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a direct, unapologetic act of aggression. I pulled one of the flags out of the ground. The soil came up around it, rich and dark, and I stood there for a long moment, clutching it in my hand. They had officially crossed the line. This wasn't just a threat. This wasn't just talk. This was a physical invasion of my space. The quiet farmer who wanted to be a good neighbor was gone, replaced by a man who was ready for a fight. And they had no idea who they were messing with. My heart, which had been thrumming with anxiety, was now filled with a cold, clear resolve. They wanted a war. I was more than willing to give them one. I had no idea how quickly that cold resolve would be put to the test. I woke up 2 weeks later, the morning air heavy and still, to a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the distant rumble of the bulldozer from the Ultra Hook. That had been a day of shocking discovery. This was something different. This was the rhythmic metallic clang of a paver and the low groan of a dump truck. I rushed to the window and looked out across the field to our western boundary. The scene that met my eyes was nothing short of a full-scale invasion. A bright yellow paver, about the size of a small school bus, was already laying a thick ribbon of asphalt down the center of my property, right where they had planted those drainage flags. A dump truck was backing up, ready to pour its load into the paver's hopper. There were women in hard hats, yelling instructions, all moving with the practiced efficiency of a crew on a job site. They weren't sneaking around. They were acting like they owned the place. My mind went completely blank. For a brief moment, the only thought I could form was a single repeated question. How are they doing this? I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I owned this land. My deed was a matter of public record. They couldn't just do this. My initial shock quickly gave way to a wave of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I grabbed my phone, shoved my feet into a pair of work boots, and sprinted out the door. When I reached the crew, I ran straight to the foreman, a heavy-set woman with a thick mustache and a hard, impassive stare. I held up my phone, my voice sharp and direct. "You need to stop this immediately. You're trespassing. This is private property." The foreman just looked at me. "Sorry, pal," she said, her voice flat. "We're on a job. Got a signed order from the HOA president. We got to finish this." "I am the property owner," I insisted, but she just shrugged and turned away. That's when I saw Karen pulling up in a shiny new pickup. She stepped out of the truck, a satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She walked right up to the edge of the new asphalt, hands on her hips, and surveyed the work with a proud, paternal air. She seemed genuinely delighted, like she was presenting me with a gift I was too dense to appreciate. I walked over to her, my voice dangerously calm. "Karen, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" She turned to me, her smirk widening. "Oh, hey, neighbor. Looks great, doesn't it? The HOA voted on it last week. We decided to move forward with the plan. It's going to connect up with our main road." "You decided?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You decided to pave a road on my land?" Karen scoffed. "Look, we've been over this. Our legal counsel has assured us that we're within our rights. It's an easement issue. An administrative error. We'll sort it out. But the road needs to be built now, for the good of the community." She was just making up words now, using legal-sounding jargon to justify a brazen act of theft. The sight of her smug, entitled face, standing on my land as if she owned it, sent a jolt of anger through me, unlike anything I had ever felt before. But I knew that yelling wouldn't solve anything. It would just give her exactly what she wanted, a desperate, whiny farmer making a scene. So I took a step back, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Karen, I'm telling you one last time to stop this construction and get off my property." She laughed. A deep, condescending chuckle that seemed to echo across my silent fields. "Or what?" she challenged, her voice dripping with superiority. "Are you going to sue the entire homeowners association? Go ahead, call a lawyer. We have a team of them on retainer. We'll drag this out for years in court, and in the meantime, this road will be finished and in use." It was a power play, a classic bully move. She was convinced that she had all the leverage, that my options were to either submit to her will or get buried in legal fees. What she didn't know was that I had already made up my mind. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, unlocked it, and started recording. "Get off my property, Karen," I said again, my voice low and steady. "I am the owner of this land, and you are committing a felony." She just kept smiling. "It's not a felony," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "It's a misunderstanding. And besides, What are you going to do? Stand in front of the paver? The crew, seeing the confrontation, had paused their work and were watching us. Karen seemed to enjoy the attention, the feeling of being in control. She was so caught up in the performance that she completely missed the shift in my demeanor. My anger was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical calm. I held up my phone so that it was clearly visible. "No, I'm not going to stand in front of the paver, Karen," I said. "I'm going to stand right here and call the sheriff's office and report a criminal act of trespassing and destruction of private property, and I'm going to make sure that the dispatcher hears you admit that you knew you were on my land." The smile on her face faltered for the first time. The color seemed to drain from her face as she realized what I was doing. Her bluster evaporated in an instant. She stammered for a moment, then began yelling at the crew, "Stop! Hold up! Just hold everything for a minute." But it was too late. I had already dialed the number. My voice was calm and steady as I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining the situation. I held the phone out so she could hear the rumble of the paver in the background, the confusion of the crew, and Karen's frantic shouting. I gave her my name, my address, and a clear, simple statement. My property is being illegally paved by a homeowners association without my consent. I have a woman named Karen who is directing the operation, and she is a known trespasser. I ended the call, and for a long moment the only sound was the distant rumble of the machinery. Karen stood there, her face a mask of shocked fury. She had been so sure she was invincible, so convinced that my only option was to get buried in paperwork. She had brought the fight to my front door, and in her arrogance, she had handed me the ammunition I needed to win the war before it had even truly begun. In that moment, surrounded by the dirt and chaos, I knew I would not be the victim in this story. I would be the victor. The siren's wail was a beautiful, soaring note in the morning air. It cut through the tension and silenced the low groan of the paver. The sheriff's deputy, a young woman I knew from town, pulled up and stepped out of her car, her expression professional and serious. I calmly walked over to her, holding out my phone with the dispatcher still on the line. I pointed to the paver, which had finally stopped, and then to Karen, who had gone from furious to pale with a palpable sense of dread. I gave my name, explained the situation, and handed the deputy a copy of my property deed that I had foresightedly tucked into my boot. The deputy listened, looked at the document, and then looked at the crew. "You're on private property," she said, her voice firm. "You're going to shut this down and get your equipment off this land immediately. This is not a request." The foreman, who was just trying to do her job, immediately started shutting things down. Karen, however, lost her mind. She started yelling, her face turning a deep, blotchy red. "This is outrageous. You can't do this. We have a right of way." The deputy just pointed a finger directly at Karen's face. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice. And you can take all your legal documents to a courtroom. Right now, you're on someone else's property without permission. This is trespassing." Karen sputtered, her whole carefully constructed image of power collapsing around her. She finally got into her truck and sped away, leaving the humiliated crew to pack up their machinery. As I watched them go, my mind began to shift. The immediate crisis was over. The physical invasion had been stopped, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the end of Act 1. I wasn't just going to fix this problem, I was going to make sure they could never do it again. I wasn't going to be reactive anymore. It was time to go on the offensive, and my first step was to build a case so overwhelming that it would leave them with no room to maneuver. I spent the next 3 days living inside a methodical, almost clinical mindset. I was no longer a farmer, I was an investigator. The first thing I did as soon as the crew was gone was grab my camera and walk the entire perimeter of my property line. I took dozens of photos, meticulously documenting the new asphalt ribbon that had been laid down, the fresh tracks in the soil, and the still present drainage flags. I made sure every single photo had a timestamp clearly visible. Then I went to the barn and pulled out my drone. I sent it up over the property and recorded a high-resolution video, a slow pan that started from the fence line and moved inwards, clearly showing the length and scope of their illegal construction. That drone footage was my ace in the hole, a piece of irrefutable, undeniable evidence. After that, I went back to the house and pulled out my old files. I had copies of everything, the original deed, the most recent survey of the property, and every single piece of correspondence from the HOA, starting from Karen's condescending initial letter. I organized everything into a neat folder, a chronological narrative of their escalating aggression. But I needed more. I needed something from their side, something that proved they knew exactly what they were doing, and that's when a small miracle happened. I got a message on social media from a woman who lived in the development. She was one of the HOA's secretaries and was completely disgusted by Karen's actions. She had been on the board and voted against the road plan, but Karen had railroaded it through. She wanted me to know that she had seen the whole thing happen and had copies of all the internal emails and meeting minutes from the HOA. She even had the email where Karen had told the board that my property was a non-issue and that they would deal with the owner later. This was everything. This was the proof that their actions weren't a misunderstanding. They were an intentional, coordinated act of bad faith. It was a gold mine of evidence. With my folder of evidence, I went to see a lawyer. I had heard he was the best in the area, a quiet man with a reputation for being absolutely relentless in the courtroom. I walked into his office with my folder, feeling a strange mix of confidence and anticipation. He was a professional, but I could tell he was taken aback by the sheer volume of evidence I'd gathered. He looked through the photos, watched the drone footage, and read through the emails, his expression growing more and more impressed. When he looked up at me, his eyes weren't just curious, they were predatory, like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Most clients come to me with a story and maybe a picture or two, he said, a faint smile on his lips. You've brought me a slam dunk case. This isn't a trespassing dispute. This is a clear case of malicious intent, property destruction, and a deliberate attempt to violate your rights. They were so confident that they weren't just building a road. They were essentially building our entire lawsuit for us. We spent the next hour mapping out a plan. It wasn't just about stopping the road. That was already done. This was about making them pay for their arrogance. We were going to file a lawsuit that would not only seek damages for the trespass and destruction of my land, but also demand that they be held financially responsible for the full cost of removing the asphalt and restoring my fields. We would also be seeking punitive damages, a way to punish them for their blatant disregard for the law. It was an ironclad, multifaceted strategy that would hit them where it hurt most, their wallets. When I left his office, I wasn't just leaving with a plan. I was leaving with a sense of calm righteousness, a quiet confidence that was a complete contrast to the chaos and anger of the previous week. Karen had dared me to call a lawyer. I had done her one better. I had armed myself with the truth, and I was about to go to war. When I left his office, I wasn't just leaving with a plan. I was leaving with a sense of calm righteousness, a quiet confidence that was a complete contrast to the chaos and anger of the previous week. Karen had dared me to call a lawyer. I had done her one better. I had armed myself with the truth, and I was about to go to war. The war began not with a roar, but with a simple summons delivered by a woman in a crisp suit. I wasn't there, but my lawyer later told me that when Karen was served with the lawsuit, She had a brief moment of pure, unadulterated shock before she began to bluster, waving the papers and insisting that this was just a frivolous attempt to extort the community. She was so confident in her position, so convinced that my case was nothing more than a desperate gamble, that she didn't even bother to take my demands seriously. She had a lawyer, a cheap, cut-rate attorney who had clearly promised her a quick victory. It was a mistake that would cost her everything. The next few months were a masterclass in legal chess, with my lawyer methodically moving pieces into place. We filed motions, answered their weak counter-arguments, and prepared for the inevitable trial. It was a slow and deliberate process, but every step of the way I felt a deep sense of calm. I had the facts, I had the evidence, and I had a lawyer who was a bulldog with a spreadsheet. We had a clear chronological narrative of their escalating aggression, and we were going to tell it to the world. And so, the day of the trial arrived. I remember walking into the courtroom and seeing Karen sitting at the defense table. She was still wearing a red suit, but the confidence that had once defined her was gone. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with a pen, her eyes darting around the room. She shot me a glare, a pathetic attempt at a show of strength, and I just met her gaze with a polite, neutral nod. The courtroom was quiet, filled with a tension you could feel in the air. The judge, a woman with a sharp gaze and an even sharper mind, took her seat, and the proceedings began. My lawyer's opening statement was a work of art. He didn't yell or grandstand. He simply laid out the facts in a calm, dispassionate tone. He described the history of my family farm, our long-standing property lines, and the peaceful existence that had been shattered by the HOA's illegal actions. He then painted a picture of Karen, a woman who, intoxicated by a small amount of power, had deliberately and maliciously orchestrated a trespass against a private citizen. He showed them the photos of the surveyors, the threatening letters, and the drone footage of the illegal paving. He presented it all as a clear, irrefutable narrative of arrogance and entitlement. Karen's lawyer was, to put it mildly, out of her depth. She tried to claim that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, a simple administrative error on the part of the HOA. She tried to argue that the road was for the good of the community and that I was simply a greedy man trying to extort his neighbors. She tried to put me on the defensive, painting me as an angry, whiny farmer. But I just sat there, listening to her baseless accusations, feeling a sense of calm detachment. She could say whatever she wanted. I knew the truth, and I had the proof to back it up. Then came the moment of truth. My lawyer called Karen to the stand. Karen walked up to the witness stand, her face a tight mask of forced confidence. She was under oath, and my lawyer was about to tear her narrative to shreds. My lawyer started with the basics, asking Karen if she had authorized the construction of the road. Karen, thinking she was clever, said, "Yes, but it was for the good of the community." My lawyer then pulled out the internal emails I had obtained, the ones that proved Karen knew the land was private. He read the one where Karen had said my property was a non-issue, and then looked at Karen and asked, "Did you, or did you not, know that this land was private property when you authorized the construction?" Karen's face went white. She stammered, her carefully constructed lie beginning to fall apart. I was led to believe there was an easement. It was a lie, and we all knew it. My lawyer then pulled out the drone footage and played it for the courtroom. The judge, Karen, and everyone else in the room watched as the drone's camera slowly panned over my fields, showing the fresh asphalt and the still present drainage flags. The silence was deafening. There was no denying it. The evidence was right there on the screen. A clear and irrefutable testament to her malice. Karen's lawyer jumped up, sputtering objections, but the judge just waved her down. She looked at Karen and, in a voice that was both calm and terrifyingly final, said, "Miss Karen, it is clear from the evidence that you knowingly and willfully trespassed on this man's private property. This was not an administrative error. This was a deliberate act of bad faith." My lawyer then presented our final request to not only cover the costs of the damages and the lawsuit, but to also pay punitive damages and to remove the road at their own expense. The amount was staggering, enough to bankrupt the HOA. Karen just stared at the judge. A woman who had gone from a self-proclaimed neighborhood hero to a humiliated, broken woman in the span of a few hours. The judge looked at her for a long moment, then turned to her clerk and, in a single quiet sentence, delivered the final glorious verdict. "I find for the plaintiff. The defendant is ordered to pay all damages, punitive costs, and to remove the road and restore the property to its previous state, effective immediately." The gavel came down with a final echoing thud. The war was over, and I had won. The gavel's final thud echoed, and the war was over. The victory was about more than a judge's ruling. It was about watching Karen's world crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. The first domino to fall was Karen herself. The public ruling and front-page news turned the very people she claimed to represent against her. Ousted from her position, she and the HOA faced a lawsuit that left them with a multi-million-dollar shortfall. The community was forced to pay an astronomical special assessment fee, a deep humiliation for every person who had trusted her. Karen had to sell her house to cover her portion, disappearing without a word, and leaving her once perfect community in financial ruin. But the real victory was the return of the heavy equipment, this time with my full permission. Paid for by the now bankrupt HOA, the machines arrived to rip up the very road they had illegally laid down. I watched from my porch as jackhammers shattered the new asphalt and bulldozers hauled the pieces away. It was the most satisfying destruction I'd ever witnessed, a literal deconstruction of their entitlement and a powerful visual of justice in action. As the weeks passed, the land was restored. The field once again looked like a field, a flat, peaceful expanse of rich, dark earth. My life returned to its rhythm, but I was changed. I had learned that peace isn't passive, it's a constant defense. I had always believed in resolving conflicts with a conversation, but I learned that with certain bullies, that approach is a liability. True strength isn't about being loud, it's about being prepared, meticulously gathering facts, and having the quiet confidence that the truth is on your side. My family and I still live on our farm, and the land feels more sacred than ever. The space where the road once was is now a quiet meadow, a reminder of what can happen when you let your guard down, and a monument to what can be accomplished when you stand your ground. I'm back to my life, a peaceful, quiet life, but I'm a little more vigilant and a lot more prepared. You can't fight entitlement with kindness. You have to fight it with calm, righteous resolve and a mountain of irrefutable evidence. And that, in the end, is the most powerful weapon of all. If you have a story like this, I want to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of justice served.